All right, today we are going to dive into a really powerful idea, one that could fundamentally reshape the American economy. It's called sectoral bargaining, and it's all about changing how we set wages and working standards, moving from a company-by-company model to looking at entire industries. So, let's get into it. So what's up with this number? 6.3%. That's how many private sector workers in the United States are in a union today. It's a number that's hovering near historic lows. But here's the fascinating part. Public approval of unions is actually near a 50-year high. That huge gap between how people feel and what's actually happening, well, it points to a much deeper economic imbalance. And if you want to see that imbalance in action, just look at this. Back in the 1970s, a CEO made, on average, about 22 times more than their typical employee. Fast forward to today, and that ratio has just exploded. We're talking over 300 to 1. This isn't just a number. It's a story about where all the economic growth from the last half-century has been going. And to really hammer this home, research from David Madlin shows that for a lot of people, when you adjust for inflation, wages have gone absolutely nowhere. They've been completely flat for decades. So you've got this mix of stagnant wages for many and skyrocketing pay at the very top. This is the exact problem that has people searching for a completely different approach. And that brings us right to the heart of this explainer, sectoral bargaining. Its supporters believe it's a way to rebalance the scales by changing the very foundation of how workers and employers negotiate. So what is it exactly? Well, instead of workers at one company negotiating their own contract, sectoral bargaining brings together workers and employers from an entire industry in a region to set standards for everyone. So imagine all the big fast food chains and their workers in a single state sitting down to negotiate one set of rules on wages and safety that applies to all of them. And this slide really breaks down the difference. The current system in the US is called enterprise bargaining. It's fragmented. You end up with thousands of different contracts. Sectoral bargaining, on the other hand, creates a common floor. The goal isn't just to get a better deal for one small group of workers. It's to lift up the standards for absolutely everyone in that industry. Okay, so why make such a big shift? Well, proponents lay out 5 key arguments for why negotiating across a whole sector is a much better way to go. Let's break them down. The whole case for this approach really rests on these 5 pillars. We're going to walk through them one by one, starting with the most fundamental one, creating a more fair and stable economy for everybody. The idea here is pretty straightforward. When you set a wage and standards floor for an entire industry, you essentially take labor costs out of the competition. It stops that race to the bottom, where companies constantly try to undercut each other by squeezing worker pay. The result? A much more stable and fair economic playing field. The second argument is all about inclusive growth. Now, this is really interesting. Research shows that this broader style of bargaining is incredibly effective at closing wage gaps. Why? Because these systems cover whole industries, they're much better at reaching workers who have historically been left out, especially women and people of color. Just look at the union wage premium here. It's significantly higher for Black and Hispanic workers. And if you think the wage gap is a big deal, the impact on wealth is even more striking. The racial wealth gap is a staggering 3 times larger for non-union workers than it is for union members. That suggests this could be a really powerful tool for building generational wealth and tackling some deep systemic inequalities. Okay, the third argument moves us from our wallets to our democracy. The thinking is, when workers organize on a much larger industry-wide scale, they build the kind of collective power that can act as a real counterbalance to corporate influence in politics. It helps make our democratic system more responsive to the needs of regular people, not just powerful interests. Fourth is about better worker protection. And it just makes sense, right? Having one single clear set of standards for an entire sector is way easier to monitor and enforce than thousands of different ones. It makes it harder for exploitation to happen and makes it crystal clear what everyone's rights are. And finally, the fifth argument is about social cohesion. Madlin's research suggests that when people are on common economic ground with similar standards, it can actually reduce social and political division. It builds solidarity because it focuses on what workers share, not on what drives them apart. So, we've heard the arguments, but does this stuff actually work in the real world? Is anyone doing this? The answer is a big yes. Let's take a look at where this is already happening. A perfect example is California's Fast Recovery Act. It literally created a council with both worker and employer representatives to set standards for the state's entire fast food industry. And their first move? A $20 minimum wage. That's a tangible result. But even more important, it gives real leverage to workers in a typically low-wage, high-turnover industry and sets a major precedent for other states to maybe follow. And it's not just California. Europe has seen a recent surge in these kinds of agreements in all sorts of industries, banking, construction, you name it. This shows that it's the flexible model that's being used right now to solve modern economic problems on a global scale.
It's also important to point out that this isn't some radical, untested idea. Our neighbors in Canada have been using this kind of bargaining for a long time in major parts of their economy. So this isn't some foreign concept. It's an established, successful practice in an economy a lot like our own.
So, after looking at all the arguments and the real-world examples, what's the big takeaway? What does this all add up to?
When you boil it all down, sectoral bargaining is about one thing: rebalancing economic power. It shifts the focus away from one single workplace and puts it on an entire industry, giving hundreds of thousands of workers a collective voice to set a real floor on wages and standards for everyone. Which leaves us with one final big question to think about. As our economy and the very nature of work keeps changing, could this shift in strategy from focusing on the company to focusing on the industry be the key to building a more equitable and stable future for all of us?